Hi, my name is Ashley Hanke, and I am an alcohol beverage attorney with Malkin Law, PA. And I counsel all three tiers of the industry, but mostly my client base is brand owners, manufacturers, importers. And so I thought it would be a good fit to come speak to you today about starting a non-alcohol brand. Federal and state background, hopefully it's not too dry, just to kind of lay the groundwork. And then going into some of the challenges that my clients have faced in starting a non-alc brand, and just kind of some of the nuances between alcohol beverage law versus non-alc, maybe how your product is categorized. Okay, so I put up some of the applicable federal acts. This list is by no means exhaustive. So we have the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which regulates the human consumption of alcohol beverages and food and non-alcohol beverages. That is enforced by the FDA. Then we have the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, which regulates the production of alcohol beverages above 0.5% or greater. That's enforced by the TTB. And then in terms of terminology, this by no means is an exhaustive list because there's low alcohol, reduced alcohol, de-alcoholized, but here we have alcohol-free, which is a phrase that basically cannot be used on product labels if there is any trace of alcohol. So this needs to be 0.0% alcohol by volume if you're going to use alcohol-free on your labels. Non-alcohol is what I'm going to kind of focus on today. So the spectrum of 0 to 0.5% alcohol by volume is what we're talking about today. We'll refer to that as non-alcohol. Again, there are nuances within that kind of spectrum, but the non-alcohol category is what we're focusing on. So quickly, I'll just go through. I highlighted some of the differences between the federal treatment of NA spirits, wine, and beer. So we call it NA spirits, non-alcoholic spirits, but actually NA spirits are excluded from the definition of spirits under the FAA because the FAA defines spirits as 0.5 and above. So we can call it an NA spirit, but it's not actually a spirit. Alcohol beverages that are below 0.5 are not subject to federal excise taxes. And here we're in the labeling jurisdiction of the FDA. So unlike spirits that are regulated by the TTB, the FDA regulates non-alcohol spirits labeling. Wine basically mirrors the previous slide. So wine is exempt, below 0.5 is exempt from the definition of wine. Wine is 7 to 24% alcohol by volume. And so that's also exempt from federal excise taxes. And again, we're in the labeling jurisdiction of the FDA with low alcohol wines, no alcohol wines. But actually the FDA regulates wines that are anywhere below 7% alcohol by volume. And then malt is where we mix things up a bit. So with malt, we're talking today about cereal beverages under that 0.5% threshold. And so malt is exempt from the IRC, the Internal Revenue Code definition of beer. And it's therefore also exempt from federal excise taxes. But here, we're sticking with the TTB labeling jurisdiction for malt beverages, cereal beverages, regardless of alcohol content. So that's still going to be regulated by the TTB. Malt beverages are still going to require a certificate of label approval from the TTB, unlike the FDA, which we'll get to. So here I put up kind of a comparison just so you could see TTB land versus FDA land. The TTB does require that pre-market label approval. Ingredient statements are optional on TTB-approved labels. And alcohol beverage regulated by the TTB, they do not have the nutrition facts panel. But as you'll see, I put up an example. There's a statement of average analysis and a serving facts panel. And TTB-regulated products may be required to contain one of those panels if you're making any caloric claims, carbohydrate claims, sugar claims. Otherwise, you're not going to see the nutrition facts panel on alcohol beverage labels. And as you can see, the information is a lot more detailed on the nutrition facts panel. And with the serving facts panel and the statement of average analysis, that's actually all of the information that the TTB is going to allow on that panel. And then when we move to the FDA, basically all other alcohol beverages, NA beverages that do not fall under the labeling jurisdiction of the FAA are going to fall under FDA regulation. So the big thing here is that the FDA does not require pre-approval of labels. So a lot of times this is kind of a big shock with my clients because even though it might seem like an extra step with the TTB, an extra regulatory burden, it's kind of a nice to have that rubber stamp of approval from the TTB saying, okay, your label's compliant. It's not that if you get a cola, you're exempt from all litigation in the future. You still could be subject to some litigation, misbranding, mislabeling under the FDA. But it is nice to kind of have that federal stamp of approval. Whereas with the FDA, it's kind of like the wild, wild west, and you're selling products in commerce without that FDA approval of labels. So here I would just really counsel my clients that if you're not well versed in FDA labeling guidelines, to make sure that you consult an expert, consult an attorney when planning out your label, designing your label, because it's a lot different from the TTB labeling guidelines. And here, as you can see, I put up an example of a nutrition facts panel as well as an ingredient statement. So ingredient statements, nutrition facts panels, and allergen disclosures are required on FDA-regulated labels unless you are eligible for an exemption. Sometimes it's the amount of units you sell or the annual dollars that you're in revenue. Otherwise, if you're not eligible for an FDA labeling exemption, you have to have that nutrition facts panel. So state treatment, I think the state treatment is less straightforward than federal treatment. So as you're probably all aware, state laws vary from state to state. And so the good news is that there is a tendency for NA products, there is a tendency for states to adopt that 0.5% threshold that I've been talking about today. So a majority of states, if they define alcohol beverages as having 0.5% alcohol by volume and above, then what you can kind of rely on is that, okay, if my product's under that threshold, then I may be exempt from state regulation altogether. And that includes, maybe price posting requirements, brand registration requirements, 3-tier system requirements. So therefore allowing you to sell direct to consumers. So it's comforting that is a majority of the states. Then we have some states that have adopted, first, we have states that have provided guidance and they've addressed some NA products. Usually, when I see it, it's in talking about malt beverages. There's very little in the way of wine and spirits, NA wine and spirits. And so usually, if there is guidance, it's on malt beverages. Kansas regulates cereal malt beverages. And Pennsylvania also has released guidance on non-alcohol beverages. I believe Pennsylvania allows their distributors to sell non-alcohol beverages. So there's very few states, and it's understandable why there's very few states that have released guidance on NA products, because obviously if your product falls outside the definition of alcohol beverages, the state alcohol beverage control boards just didn't contemplate those products when the laws were written. And then to complicate things a bit further, some states have very broad definitions of alcohol beverages, and those definitions may not include that magic 0.5% threshold. So I put up an example of Georgia. As you can see, that threshold is not listed in Georgia. And so what does that mean? If your malt beverage, your ingredients, your method of manufacture meets that definition, and let's say your malt beverage is 0.2% alcohol by volume, then you're still treated as an alcohol beverage. Maybe this was an unintended consequence because you didn't realize that Georgia defines it this way. And therefore, in Georgia, you cannot direct ship to consumers beer. So there are some unintended limitations that you need to be aware of. And we kind of went over this. Obviously, there are more opportunities than there are limitations. So direct-to-consumer shipping in many states, widespread access to both unlicensed and licensed premises on and off-premise, and then your non-traditional retail outlets, your Williams-Sonoma, your pharmacies, your grocery stores that would not have had the adequate licensing if you were trying to sell alcohol beverages. So definitely many more opportunities. However, there are some limitations, as we discussed in Georgia. New York is another example. So in some states have very, very specific or rigid licensing structures. So in New York, they define the list that I put up is exhaustive of what you can sell in New York package stores or liquor stores. And so that does not include carbonated beverages. That does not include mixers. That does not include non-alcohol products. So just being aware and watching out for the unintended consequences of how states define your product. And then, these are the key considerations. So when I'm counseling a client starting a non-beverage, non-alcohol brand, this is kind of my mental checklist that I go through. Really, I would say the biggest thing is that I see my clients, They usually come to me. They don't come to me at this outset of their venture. They come to me once they've run into a roadblock, or they've formulated their product, they've designed the label, and they say, "Oh, Ashley, I want you to take one quick final review of the labels. We want to print them tomorrow." It's always a rush. And maybe I have, 10 corrections on the labels. The nutrition facts panel is not even on the label. And so really just, I would say, before going down the rabbit hole, before, spending marketing dollars, before really, I would say, know your product, know your ingredients, know your method of manufacture, know that projected final ABV. And once you know that, then you can compare your product with state and federal definitions and see how your product's going to fit in, especially in states that you want to focus sales on. So you don't have those kind of unintended consequences that I talked about. This is the checklist, and if you have any questions, that's my contact information. But thank you for your time.